Hey, I'm Ron Marz.
Okay. Can you just tell us how you got involved with Top Cow and basically got in the comic book industry?
I actually got into the comic book industry about 20 years ago. So I've been doing this for longer than I care to remember, actually. And I got in because I was friends with Jim Starlin, who's a classic writer-artist, has been doing comics since the early 70s. I was buddies with Jim and still am. And he kind of took me by the hand and brought me into Marvel and showed me the ropes, and I've been doing it ever since. So, as with most everybody in this business, you end up doing, you work for one company and then you go across the street to the other one, and everything kind of evolves. Started at Marvel, went to DC, worked for a number of other companies in between, and still freelance for a few different places, but my home for the last 3 years or so has been Top Cow for the most part, who have kind of given me most of their toys to play with and give me a lot of rope, probably just enough to hang myself. But the relationship is great, so I do most of my stuff there these days.
All right. So I think we've used the words architect, maestro, I forgot what else descriptions we had for you, since you seem to write pretty much everything that comes out of Top Cow and Darkness. How far out do you plan when it comes to it?
I like to have kind of a general plan. I like to know where we're supposed to end up, but I think if you end up setting too much in concrete, the work becomes kind of stale. I think you want that sense of discovery to be still possible as you're writing the stuff. So, I like to say I need to know where I'm going to start, and I need to know where, for the most part, I'm going to finish, and everything else in between is kind of negotiable. So, to me, the journey is the part that's interesting. It becomes kind of stale if you're not open to the characters and the story taking you places that you didn't expect.
And during the panel, there's a lot of talk about you try to take extra steps to make sure that pretty much all the comics are pretty. You can get into it if you've never read a Top Cow comic, but at the same time, there's a lot for people who've always been a fan or a longtime reader. And then you have all these various series that kind of revolve and are interconnected. Do you find any issues either making sure to go the extra special distance to make sure it's accessible, or just interconnecting such a varied universe?
It's just part of the job. I feel like that's just one of the aspects that should come into playwriting. It's like being a baseball player. You have to be able to hit for average, you have to be able to hit for power and field and run. There's a lot of different aspects to the job. It's not really that much different for a writer, because you have to be able to do different things. If you're just writing for the audience you already have, you're never going to grow your audience. It's only going to shrink. I feel like it's a disservice to the readers to only preach to the converted. And a lot of comics do that. A lot of comics don't really bother to make the material accessible. They're just playing to their longtime fans, which I guess is okay, but it just seems like you leave so many people out in the dark. I never want to have somebody come up to me and say, I tried this book and I didn't understand what the hell was going on. To me, that's a failure of craft. If you can't figure out a way to make your story accessible to new readers and rewarding to the longtime readers, you need to sit down and do the story over again.
Interesting. So the thing that kind of strikes me with it, I remember many years ago when Top Cow first started. I don't even remember how many years ago. It feels like it was, a decade? 15 years?
More than 15 years, yeah.
To me, that was always striking with was the art. The art's always been gorgeous. And I was never much of a Top Cow reader back when it started. And then I think you actually were the one who reached out to me and was like, why aren't you covering Top Cow stuff? And I started reading your stuff. And I find it amazing that it's a mix of it's beautiful art, great stories, and great characters. And you guys mentioned during the panel a couple times it seems like it's a philosophy of the company that it's not, we don't want to be just beautiful art with a shallow story, which some other companies are, or great story with horrible art, that there's just a concerted effort to mix the two?
Well, the short version of that is that's what comics are. I mean, if all you're offering is great art, you know, go to a gallery show and look at the pictures on the wall. And if all you're offering is a great story, well, then pick up a novel and don't bother to draw any pictures. What comics does better than any other medium, as far as I'm concerned, is the combination of story and art, and the way they work together, the way those separate pieces come together to make a greater whole. And to me, that's where the magic happens. That's where comics do things better than film, better than television, better than novels, better than painting. There's a magic to how all that works together to tell you a story. And if you're not taking advantage of all of that, it's kind of a wasted opportunity. So to me, I try to think visually when I write the scripts, because, you know, if you don't want a visual story, you're probably not reading comics anyway. I want to make sure that the art has impact and is powerful, because to me the art is what gets you in the door. The art is what the allure is to comics, and then the story is what keeps you coming back every month.
So Top Cow, it's not just beautiful artwork, but it's also great stories, great characters, and one that really kind of sticks out to me is the relationship between Danielle Baptiste and Finch. You have two, are they gay, are they not gay characters, especially with Danielle, who seems to be discovering herself still, that you don't really find too many other comics. And I keep on saying it every time I read it oh, this has to get nominated for a GLAAD award when they do their awards every year. So I guess the first is, how did that relationship, where did it evolve from? Because I can't think of any other characters in the Top Cow universe that are gay or bisexual or...
It really just evolved from me wanting to do something that I hadn't done before. I'd written some gay supporting characters in Green Lantern, but it was really they were supporting characters. They weren't main characters, and it was more of a a nod to the diversity that you would expect to find in Greenwich Village in New York. For Danny and Finch, I really liked the idea that Danny wasn't certain of her sexuality and wasn't at all comfortable with the feelings she was having. I thought that was a lot more interesting character-wise, and it made for a better character arc. That sense of discovery is, to me, a lot more interesting than a character who is certain of who they are and what they're doing. I mean, to me, it's the difference between an everyman character like Spider-Man, who strives and fails and strives and succeeds, and there's meat on the bones for that character, compared to somebody like the Punisher, who was is a really interesting character, but is a bit of a one-note character in terms of who he is and how he approaches things. He is what he is. He's unchanging. He's a rock instead of a sponge. And for Danny and Finch, I just thought it would be cool to explore that and to see how those aspects of her character played into the overall storyline, which is obviously more of a fantastic, the kind of fantastic stuff we do in comics. I just thought it would be interesting to have that, have those two things kind of meet, and maybe her figuring out who she is also reflected in her assuming the role of the Angelus. It's kind of a twin storytelling tactic, that as she discovers her own sexuality, she's also discovering her role as the Angelus. And to a certain extent, there have been lesbian Angelus bearers who have been, frankly, fairly one-note characters. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to flesh out the Angelus concept as much as possible. So that was also an aspect, and I wanted to deal with, when you become the Angelus, do you become a lesbian? I mean, is it that simple, or is there a lot more to it? And I think the next couple of issues will show that it's a lot more to it, and that it's hopefully a more complex answer than you get in most comics.
I'd say it was the last issue, it was issue 4, her father kind of walks in on him, who seems to be in the darkest of what's going on. I know coming out to parents tends to be a pretty big, weighty topic that a lot of people have to deal with. Have you talked to people about their experiences and use that for the story, or just kind of going off of what?
It's not like I went out and did research,
Yeah.
but it's more the, it's more like just having gay or lesbian friends and just kind of understanding the world that they live in, and how how they've approached getting to that place, and whether it was easy or hard, or the reception that they've had when they've come out. My goal with the story was not to get on a soapbox and do an ABC after school special. I'm not interested in that preachy kind of stuff. To me, it's a lot more interesting to just examine her character and see how all of that affects her.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, I think it's worked really well. You have the duality of her dealing with becoming the Angelus, and this is new to her, and coming with that part of her life, and then this other personal aspect of it. It plays well. It really plays well together.
Well, thanks. Hopefully there's a symbolic reflection in both ways, and that by the time we get to the last issue of the miniseries, she's more complete than when she started.
And then the other is she's in New Orleans. I think New Orleans, if I remember right.
Yeah, she's in New Orleans.
You plan on maybe addressing Katrina at all, or is that just kind of separate from the Top Cow universe? And
I actually went into the miniseries feeling like we would address that a bit, and there's a couple of lines of dialogue that are kind of a nod to it. But as I got further into the story, I really felt like it was putting the Katrina stuff into the story as as an additional element, as a side note, wasn't really fair and wasn't really appropriate.
Becomes a footnote instead of a.
Yeah, I felt like it wasn't a storytelling tool, or shouldn't be a storytelling tool. If we do some more stories with Danny as the Angelus later on, I would like to examine it, but excuse me, have that aspect be front and center in the story, not just background material. So I felt like I would rather not address it to a great extent than do a half-assed job of addressing it and maybe even offend somebody. I mean, I still feel for that city and that region and what they went through, and particularly the government response, which was shameful. And I don't want to just use that as story fodder flippantly.
So I guess the final question is, for folks who are not familiar with the Top Cow universe, why should they give Top Cow a chance?
You mean other than I'm writing it?
Yeah, other than the fantastic writing and the fantastic art.
Other than the fantastic writing? It's a different flavor. I'm forever saying that I feel like comics need to be more, and certainly need to be perceived as more than just superhero stories. And the American market in particular is a lot of superhero stories. It's what Marvel and DC do. It's their bread and butter, and those are great. But I always liken it to, I like pizza, but I don't want to have it 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. I think what we do at Top Cow is a little bit of a different flavor on the menu. For the most part, it's not straight superhero stories. Even something like Velocity, which is more of a superhero-centric story, has some science fiction elements in it. And, we try to do the kinds of stories and the kinds of characters that you don't get other places. We try to be the A&E or the HBO to the network programming that the other publishers have. So there's nothing wrong with superheroes. I read them myself, but I think you can have more in your diet than a steady stream of superheroes. So we're going to give you characters that don't quite fit into that mold, and we're going to give you stories that are a little edgier and maybe a little bit more mature than you're apt to get from a typical superhero story.
Appreciate it.
No
Great.
problem. Happy
Thanks.
to do it.